I'm a great fan of political correctness. And you won't hear many people say that, saying, oh, I'm very politically correct. Of course not. It's always rather shamefaced. But you step back and have a minute's thought, and you see that it's done a great deal of good. And the idea that you can shrug off these constraints and the American unbound is suddenly free again to be a racist, to be a misogynist, to be a homophobe. Oh, great, that's what we want. I think that's just an excuse for being a pig, basically.
This latest episode of My Martin Amis finds me sat on the floor of a hotel room, the Royal National Hotel in Bloomsbury. Opposite my next guest, Ross Barkan. He is a novelist, journalist, and New Yorker. His latest of his 3 novels, Glass Century, was published earlier this year, and he has chosen Inside Story to talk about with me today. Ross, thanks very much for coming on the show. And may I ask, what brings you to London? You're normally based on the other side of the pond.
Yeah, it's a mix of business and pleasure. I'm meeting various friends and colleagues. Something that's happened over the past years, I have developed friendships across the pond in the writing world. I do a column with the New Statesman. There's many talented writers there and several of them I've become friends with. And seeing them talking to a potential UK publisher and just kind of getting around a bit. I mean, it's a little bit of a holiday as well. It's an easy flight from New York. It's only 7 hours and change. And I've grown fond of London. I actually never came to London until 2023. And then I have been back a few times since. I mean, it's has the flavor of New York. It's kind of a pastoral New York a little bit. It's a more relaxing New York. And I've gotten to know it. I always stay now in this hotel, which you name checked because it's right in the heart of London. I've grown to like Bloomsbury. I mean, obviously the literary heritage, you feel it. I was a Virginia Woolf fan from college. I wrote a very mediocre college thesis on several of her novels, and you still, even though this is now a very touristy and college student spot, you still feel that history, and you see the plaques on the wall, for Roger Fry and Wolfe and all these.
That's right, the whole Bloomsbury set.
Great figures, yes. Just
Bertrand Russell, T.S. Eliot.
Russell. Yeah. You walk right by him too. So it's just it's good to come here, and it's a nice mix of networking and also just seeing friends and enjoying myself. And I feel there is a real richness to the literary discussion among young Brits. Not that it's not there in America as well, but I've been forming some real rich friendships built around books and literature, and that's really excited me. And I love to get the British perspective on what's happening.
You and me both. In any case, you are originally from Bay Ridge, is that right?
Yeah, so I'm from a leafy, somewhat suburban feeling neighborhood that is in the city. So it's a very nice mix of the car culture of the suburbs. I do like to drive a car, which not everyone likes, at least among the pro-transportation set in New York City, though I also ride the subway every day. And also, it's a very urban-feeling neighborhood, too. There's a lot of excellent bars and restaurants. It's most famous, probably, in the culture for being the setting of Saturday Night Fever. And if you watch Saturday Night Fever to this day, the culture of the neighborhood has changed. It's not the same Italian working-class culture that Tony Manero, John Travolta came out of, but the physical nature of the neighborhood has not shifted very much, and it's fun to see it as a local, and also just for anyone who maybe wants to go catch the sights, you still can. A lot of it looks very similar, and it's a fascinating place. It's politically very different than what one would expect in New York City. It's a politically diverse neighborhood. A lot of conservatives and Republicans there. There's a Palestinian population that's been growing over the years, an Arab population, a Greek population that's been there for a long time. A lot of Catholics too. I tell my Catholic friends on both sides of the pond. As a Jew, I really grew up around Catholics. It is not a very Jewish neighborhood. There's one Jewish synagogue, but beyond that, it's churches. You go there, it's the real Irish, Italian, American, Catholic working and middle class. That was kind of the beating heart of the neighborhood for many decades.
As we've said, you are the author of 3 novels, and, it takes a New Yorker to know a New Yorker, and in particular, your latest novel. And something that's actually followed you throughout your career so far is your observations and opinions about Donald Trump, and how, as a New Yorker, you understand or can perceive him perhaps with kind of a local familiarity, maybe. Martin Amis in Inside Story has a whole passage devoted to Donald Trump. I wonder whether you have strong opinions about how he portrays him in this.
I think one feeling I have is that a lot of the novelists and the thinkers of that era, and this I guess this will be the point of the podcast where I criticize Amis just a bit and I apply it to others as well, didn't always have the most novel things to say about Donald Trump. So I think of Philip Roth in this. Roth, at the end of his life, would he wouldn't really write columns, but I think he was interviewed, if I recall. It may have been the New Yorker. I forget where it was. And obviously he's like, Trump's a bad guy. Trump is this, Trump is that. And he is. I mean, I don't support Donald Trump, and I'm deeply critical of him. And
no, in fact, it's important to mention that you resigned the day after the Observer endorsed Trump.
Yes.
In the New York Republican primary.
Yes.
You later told CNN, a line had been crossed, and I thought it was time for myself to depart.
Yes, and that was an interesting episode of my life. I was only 26 years old. I was leaving a very good job at the New York Observer, which was once an excellent newspaper, because Jared Kushner was the owner of our paper for a long time. And he'd been a good owner until Trump ran for president. And then he's starting to meddle with the newspaper in ways I didn't like. And they weren't being straightforward with me. In particular, that endorsement, I was told they'd stay neutral. I was the national political reporter. And then they wrote a very absurd, over-the-top endorsement piece that I did not like. And that was kind of the last straw at that point. I knew I couldn't stay there. I've always tried to see Trump for all his complexity and kind of for the context he came out of. And so there's a bit of I find older liberals sometimes, orange man bad. I'm not saying Amis is doing that, but I try to ground Trump very much in the traditions he came out of. So that is New York City, and also why he has appeal. And it's not simply that all Americans are fascist or all the people who support Donald Trump are fascist and racist. Now, some might be, but America is a very fascinating and fraught and complicated country. And something I like about Amis is he has a great fascination with America. He is this sort of, obviously he moved there and he lived in Brooklyn. He was very drawn to it. I think there is a certain dynamism, sometimes demonic, but there is a dynamism there that if you're a writer, an artist, intellectual, it's hard to quit. I have a lot of problems with America, and I actually love traveling to Europe. I love coming to London. Could I ever not live in America? I don't think so. I think I feel too tied to the country.
Right, okay.
And I also feel being in America, being in New York City, there is a certain amount of a certain demented zeitgeist that you draw from and you look to. And I think Amis was that way. Many of his novels, there are characters coming to America. The information has that whole book tour.
You mean to say there's a lot of energy to draw on by living in America?
I think so, yes.
As a writer?
Yes, I think so. I think America is a deeply flawed country. I think we have a bad healthcare system. I think we have a gun problem that will never get solved.
But all of these things are fascinating problems to a writer.
They are, and I would say even just beyond those, I think we can fix healthcare and fix guns and still be a very interesting country. And I want those things fixed.
Right.
But I think there's a certain bigness to America. There's a kind of natural ambition that comes with a country that is so vast, is so different. I mean, you really have to think of America as like Europe itself, where instead of the European Union, you've got the country of Texas and the country of California.
Of course, yeah.
And you cannot fully know America and be there your entire life. And I think there's a certain excitement to that. And there's so many cultures buried within America. And I do think from the literary tradition, I mean, every country has a great literary tradition to some degree. But there is the American literary tradition is so just multifaceted, multi-layered, so many different kinds of writers, you know, so many different regions. There is just something that, for me at least, is hard to leave behind. And New York in particular, I mean, I myself, you know, I have more of a love-hate relationship with New York than I think my reputation would suggest. I mean, I will defend New York, especially if people are critical of it, but it's a city that is not perfect by any means, and it's a city that can wear you out and exhaust you, and it's expensive, and there is this kind of chaos energy that permeates it, which you don't find in other cities. But also, I mean, there's a reason a lot of artists either are from there. New Yorkers seeded 20th century American culture. There's no 20th century American culture without New York City, or you extend it to the tri-state area, include New Jersey for Philip Roth, who's basically very close to being a New Yorker.
I understand what you mean about New York. It doesn't have a sort of blissed out vibe that LA does. It's full of conflicts and kvetching and outspoken frustration. I make no apology, by the way, about making Donald Trump the focus of this episode, partly because in the episode where we tackled Inside Story with the novelist Anthony Quinn, we covered so much else in this. What is it that it takes a New Yorker to recognize about Trump? Trump
has what I've called in an essay that I published shortly after his win last year. He has what I call the outer-borough mindset. And to some extent, if I think about England, you can see some of that in how the rest of England views London. I think there's some of that dynamic between Manhattan and the 4 other boroughs of New York City. And it's important to remember that New York is 5 counties or boroughs, and each of them is large enough to be a city unto itself. Some, like Brooklyn and Queens, would be among America's 5 largest cities if they stood alone. And the dynamic of New York City in the 20th century, I think it's dissipating a bit in the 21st, was Manhattan was the city on the hill. It was the gleaming spires. It was that great glassy terrain one had to get to if you were ambitious. If you were a serious person, you went to Manhattan. If you were a serious person, you lived in Manhattan. If you see a lot of TV and pop culture of the 20th century, this comes up again and again. Sex and the City, there's a whole arc where one of the characters moves to Brooklyn, and this is as late as the 1990s and early 2000s is viewed as a kind of sacrilege for someone who's an ambitious young professional. I mentioned Saturday Night Fever before, a movie that captures this very acutely. That the plot of the movie is there's this young Italian-American played by John Travolta who's a disco dancer and kind of a bum from the neighborhood, a little bit like Rocky Balboa. And he's got a love interest who also is from the neighborhood. They speak with these very thick New York accents, which I enjoy. My mother speaks with one. I lost it, but there are people out there who still do.
Can you affect it for us?
Oh, absolutely, yes, I can. I can talk. I could talk like a New Yorker. If you want me to do the whole podcast like this, I could do it.
This is fantastic. What do you mean when you refer to this outer-borough mindset?
It's the resentment and the hunger people feel in the outer boroughs towards Manhattan. It's the resentment they have to the city. People from the outer boroughs will call Manhattan just the city. If you grew up where you go, I'm going to the city. And it's those who are ambitious wanting to make it there. And Donald Trump, from a very early age, must get to Manhattan. Manhattan is where everything is. Donald Trump's father was incredibly successful. Fred Trump was a major real estate developer in New York City far better at it than Donald ever was, built scores of subsidized middle-class housing. He was also a racist as well. And he made a lot of money. But he was frugal. He's not flashy. They lived in a very nice but not spectacular home in a kind of suburban part of Queens. But Fred was very content to be the outer-borough power broker. Donald could not stay there in Queens. To do what Fred did to Donald was a form of failure. I mean, Donald admired his father quite a bit, but he had to get to Manhattan. So as soon as he's in his 20s, he is trying to become a Manhattan figure. He wants to be taken seriously by Manhattan. He wants to have his big projects, his name in gold. He wants to be part of high society. And the fundamental tension of Donald Trump that exists to this day, and it's something I think if he has any kind of introspection, he would maybe admit, is he wants to be taken seriously by high society, by Manhattan, by the New York Times, by this kind of taste-making 1%, but he never will be. He's too uncouth. He's too outer-borough. He's too gaudy. And no matter what he does, he's president of the United States. And a lot of these people still don't take him seriously. Now, they are afraid of him. They will do business with him. But fundamentally, compare him to Michael Bloomberg, for example. Michael Bloomberg, of course, the mayor of New York City, one of the very richest men in the world, much richer than Donald Trump. Michael Bloomberg, though he's not from New York originally, he embodies that upper crust Manhattan. Michael Bloomberg is that not 1%, it's like 0.001% that has that sort of tact. Like when you're that rich, you're Manhattan rich. You can be gaudy, but you also need a little bit of that aristocratic reserve. Trump has none of that, but Trump wants to be taken seriously. He wants to be the Manhattan guy, and that was how he spent much of his young life.
And so he transposed that outsider's resentment on a national level,
yes,
and used that to tap into Middle America and the Rust Belt.
Yes, and that was something no one, including myself, would have predicted.
Amis does talk about the fact that in The Art of the Deal, he appears, as he puts it, adverse to the rough and ready manner in which his dad built his empire through real estate acquisition and rent collection. I think it would be a good moment, having explored your hinterland as a New Yorker, to read from that passage in which he gives his breakdown of the personality and the psychology of Donald Trump. And then maybe we can discuss both how you perceive the degree to which Amis gets it right and things that you feel he misses.
So it says that this chapter is called Guideline, Literature, and Violence. So, from the Lord Protector to the Great Pretender, exactly a year has gone by since Donald J. announced, I'm sure you recall the scene on the burnished chariot of the Trump Tower escalator, June 2015. And now is a good time to pause, take stock, and get our bearings. In my struggle to assimilate Donald Trump, as you see, The Art of the Deal, 1987, Think Big and Kick Ass in Business and Life, 2007, and Crippled America, his campaign manifesto released last November, are there on the table. I found some guidance in two oddly undervalued hypotheses, namely the Barry-Manilow law and the Maggot probability. Let's begin with the Barry-Manilow law, promulgated by Clive James. When faced by the inexplicable popularity of this or that performer or operator, aptly the Barry-Manilow law, which states everyone you know thinks Barry Manilow is absolutely terrible, but everyone you don't know thinks he's great. And bear in mind that the people you know are astronomically outnumbered by the people you don't know. As with Barry, so with Donald. But there's an important difference. The Barry Manilow fans cannot increase my exposure to Barry Manilow, but the Donald Trump fans can certainly make me watch, hear, and otherwise attend to Donald Trump, maybe until February 2025, when I'll be well over 70 and more to the point, he'll be nearing 80. If that happens, then the Maggot probability, formulated by Kingsley Amis, will come into play. It would work as follows. Faced day after day by the senseless notions and actions of an elderly madcap, I won't bother to parse and analyze. I'll simply shrug and say to myself, it's probably just the maggot, or alternatively, the maggot's probably acting up. The maggot is the virus or bacterium or actual grub with antennae and maw that devours an aging brain, and the maggot acts up whenever it finds a patch of relatively healthy gray matter and settles down to a square meal. I adopt this facetious tone more or less willy-nilly because Trump's candidacy is in itself a sick joke. It began as a business venture, an attempt to boost his tarnished brand, mineral water neckties. Then someone like Steve Bannon told him that his only imaginable route to Pennsylvania Avenue lay in white supremacism. And Trump, perhaps recognizing that whiteness endorsed by maleness was his only indisputable strength, limply acquiesced. Next, having registered the stupendous welcome given to this approach, Trump began underscoring it with the moronic sincerity of violence, inciting his crowds to beat the crap out of protesters, and openly thirsting for mass deportations and collective punishments, plus more torture and more police brutality. Doing harm to the defenseless, it seems, to a recent enthusiasm, an urge awakened or unleashed by his political rise. And on the way, he has discovered something about himself. He likes it. He's one of those people who finds violence exciting, which surprised me, I confess. In his memoir, The Art of the Deal, heavily and cleverly ghosted by Tony Schwartz, Donald, then aged 40, comes across as a man instinctively averse to the rough and ready aspects of his trade, coercive rent collections, coercive evictions, etc., associating that kind of thing with his rags to riches father, the gnarled and mottled Fred C. Trump. And while Fred was applying himself in the outer boroughs, the young Donald, his gaze on Manhattan, was tonally nourishing loftier dreams and visions. We therefore presume that Trump's sudden liking for violence is just another corruption. Violence vivifies his proximity to power. Joe the plumber never got anywhere. As against that, next month in Cleveland, Ohio, Don the realtor will be anointed as the... But wait, I'll return to Trump at the end of the section, if there's time. As you know, tomorrow morning we're off to England. And after that, you'll also be away for a while. So let's get on. And he won't be changing the subject. The subject will still be violence.
Amis says in that passage that he adopts a tone of facetiousness, more or less willy-nilly. Do you think Trump warrants more seriousness than Amis gives him? And to what extent do you think that Amis characterizes him correctly?
I do. I do think he warrants more analysis. I think there's a long American tradition that Donald Trump comes out of. There's the tradition of Nixon, the silent majority. There are the older populists like William Jennings Bryan. There are a host of currents coming through the country that lead to Trump. And I do wish Amis gave a bit more, because he was such a brilliant writer and thinker. But I do feel there is a point where the kind of older liberal tends to not consider Trump very much in his context, or give very much thought to why Trump found support.
Yeah, it surprises me that the same writer that portrayed John Self so vividly in Money considers Trump to be nothing more than a sick joke.
No, it's a really good point about Self. Not something I considered. Yes, Amis was so good on New York in that period, and that is Trump. So he knows it intimately. I also don't love the easy hand-waving away of Trump in calling him a white supremacist. I think Trump is far more complicated than being merely someone who wants white American rule. Trump's a New Yorker. Trump grew up around non-white people, did business with them, befriended some of them. It's like when people say Trump is anti-Semitic, or he has supporters who are, but Trump, to me, almost, he's very Jewy. I say this as a Jewish writer. Trump like could be Jewish. He's almost there in terms of his mannerisms and how he kind of deals with the world occasionally.
I might have to ask you to unpack that. I've never heard anyone describe Trump as having...
New York. It's a sort of like, mid-century New York hyperbole.
Right.
The talking with your hands, which I do. The willingness to argue. I mean, Trump doesn't come from the neurotic intellectual tradition. He's
but
neither
more the
neurotic,
splenetic, I suppose.
Yeah. And neither neurotic nor intellectual. But there is some of that there. And in terms of calling him a white supremacist, Amis was writing this in the 2010s, so some electoral trends wouldn't be available to him until later in time, but Trump actually has a lot of support amongst Latinos and some blacks and some Asians, and it's not just a white vote. And I think Donald Trump is destructive in many ways, but he's not the Ku Klux Klan, and he's not necessarily interested in the things that some of his supporters might be. Now, there are racist Donald Trump supporters, but I always thought that you can't characterize the entire Trump project that way. And even Trump himself is he's anti-immigrant, he's xenophobic. At the same time, he is not one who simply has these kind of blood and soil dreams that perhaps some in his party do.
I suppose there's a limit to which we can demand and expect that writers of a certain age should be able to grapple with the zeitgeist as well as they did in previous decades when they were at the peak of their powers and popularity. But you as a novelist and journalist are acutely interested in the 21st century, the century that Amis and his peers aged into and then I think lost the will to fight with.
Well, there are a lot of extremely talented older novelists, male and female, and writers who will wade into politics. But I confess I can't think of a single one who's offered something incisive about Donald Trump. I read the New York Review of Books, and the New York Review of Books is very good at getting writerly people to opine on Trump. They had a whole, I think, against Trump issue around the election time. And it was all just, you couldn't divorce it from Democratic Party talking points. And I say this as someone on the left. I'm not not someone who ever would vote for Trump. And I do think some of it might be age. I'm sure I will be less out of touch with the culture when I'm older. I like, you and many others, grew up with Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump became president when I was just turning 27 years old. He'd been running for president, since I was 25. He'd been a cultural figure for the entirety of my life. And I felt even then, I remember writing pieces in early 2016 about how the Trump phenomenon had to be taken seriously because it was this populist revolt. It might be one that is wrongheaded and is not going to make people's lives better. But the fact was he was running against the Republican establishment that wanted nothing to do with him. And he was going straight to the people and winning millions of votes. And that had to be reckoned with. Why were these people supporting him? And I do feel for Amis and for a lot of writers of a certain era, of a certain sort of center-left liberal persuasion, there was a kind of mental block or exhaustion where they just saw him as disgusting, as absurd, and just not worth bothering with in any real fashion, right? I mean, Martin Amis, the Martin Amis of the 1980s would have really had a lot of interesting things to say about Donald Trump.
Absolutely.
It's notable too in that passage. I mean, there are a few tragic undertones to it. One, he invokes February 2025. Obviously, Martin's not with us anymore in February of 2025, and Donald Trump is president again. So he. No one could forecast that necessarily. But now with some, with real hindsight that we have now, we can at least start to take this all very seriously because the Trump era has spanned a full decade. If you go back to when he announced his run for the presidency, to his 4 years out of office when he's running again and he's so much in the news, to now, I mean, you will have an era that spans 13 years of American history. And that puts him on par with Nixon, with Reagan, That makes him a significant historical figure. When you are a significant historical figure, you deserve significant historical analysis. And I do think our intellectual class, there are a lot of young writers who are doing interesting commentary and kind of assessment of Trump. But in terms of the literati, these kind of older literary lions, I really can't think of any of them who said anything remotely interesting about Donald Trump. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but nothing comes to mind.
We're recording this on Friday, the 11th of July, and on Monday of this week, London observed the 20th anniversary of the 7/7 bombings, and we are, in fact, on the same road on which one of the main attacks occurred. That brings me to 9/11. When you remember what those events felt like to live through in New York, how well do you think Amis was able to capture the events of that day?
Yeah, I thought that Amis does capture some of that quite well. I think he gets at the enormity, the psychic enormity of what happened. I much more so than I think the Trump rupture, which was his own kind of historical rupture. I think, even if you were far away, you could feel that day very viscerally. I mean, it felt like an attack on the world. So I think there is something to having been there and lived through it directly, but at the same time, that was the sort of spectacular attack on the heart of empire, the modern empire, America, that I do think someone like Amis, he was up to the task for. I do think so. And whether outflowing from that were opinions of which some might have been regrettable. I think Amis was very good at understanding how history shapes us and understanding how we grapple with it. And it's something I think about in my own fiction. I mean, my novel Glass Century is heavily 9/11 shadows it quite heavily, and the cover very intentionally features the Twin Towers, and I write a whole 9/11 scene, and a character perishes in the tower. So,
for now, building on the New York theme of this episode, I think it would be good for us to hear another reading from the chapter headed September 11th, the day after.
The coffee cup, the ashtray, the open exercise book. He sat slumped at his desk. To repeat, it was September 12th, 2001, and for the time being his work in progress, a novel, seen neither here nor there, nor anywhere else. The way he now saw it, this particular fiction, and for that matter fiction itself, Middlemarch, Moby Dick, Don Quixote, was demoted to non-entity by World War III or whatever it was that announced itself the previous day. He would soon learn that all the novelists and all the poets and dramatists were being asked by the Fourth Estate to write about September 11th. Ian had already written about it, and Christopher, of course, had already written about it. Salmon and Julian would be writing about it. All of them were asked, and all of them said yes. What else was there to write about? What else was there to do? Asked that morning by The Guardian to write something about September 11th, he said yes. And so he turned to a fresh page and scrawled September 11th at the top of it. He wrote his fiction and his journalism in the same exercise books. So he just turned to a fresh page and began to unearth his parallel self, the one that wrote about reality in editorial or op-editorial mode. He usually made this switch with reluctance, even with some self-pity. But that morning he went about it with numb resignation. Then he just sat there numbly smoking. The part of him that produced fiction, he felt, was in any case shutting down forever. And how did it feel? If you took its pulse that day, it felt like a very minor addition of grief, to be tacked on to the grief that was due to the thousands of dead. No one yet knew how many thousands, 8, 10? And most particularly, most essentially, to those who found themselves leaping from the towers, leaping out into the blue, and dropping 70, 80, 90 floors rather than stay for another instant within. They fell at the rate of 32 feet per second, squared, and, as we later heard with our own ears, exploded like mortar shells when they hit the ground. They were not suicide bombers, these people. They were suicide bombs, and some of them were themselves already on fire. So no fiction, thank you. He couldn't be doing with fiction. because fiction was partly a form of play, and reality was now earnest. With his stiffened and throbbing right hand, he reached out and wrote, "One, all over again, the world seems bipolar." And yes, it really did. One day in the very early 1990s, Martin made an announcement to Nat and Gus. They're perhaps 7 and 6. "I'm so glad you won't have to live out your childhood under that shadow, as I did." He meant what he said, and they peered up at him, all meek and grateful. The shadow he had in mind derived from the Cold War and the equation E equals MC squared, in other words, in Eric Hobsbawm's words. The 40-year contest of nightmares. And that shadow did go, or it receded, to be replaced yesterday by another shadow. And what did that shadow derive from? "It's an ideology within a religion," said Christopher on the phone. "This is fascism with an Islamic face."
I attended a talk recently by Hanif Qureshi about his paralysis and the fact that he's not in the mood to write fiction when something so tragic has happened to him and transformed his life so thoroughly.
The remark about fiction you heard a lot then, though of course novels would continue to get published, but there was a brief sense that this event was so enormous and terrible and strange that writing fiction wasn't the thing to do. And I would disagree with that, but of course I have the privilege of hindsight. I don't blame, I think Amis is very good. He's capturing his mood at that time. He, of course, didn't feel that way either because he was then writing novels. Now, he stopped writing fiction perhaps for that day or maybe a week, I don't know. But then he returns to the novel because we need novels to grapple the reality. And that was something Amis understood very well. But I think what I like about the passage, it gets at that mindset that existed at that time. And then, of course, the remark that Christopher makes, which I'm sure is very true, in that the Christopher Hitchens of the real world, not just the novel, felt that way about this new struggle, that it was a new Cold War, but perhaps against a more vicious opponent. And interestingly enough, and Amis couldn't have known this in 2001, Islamofascism, whatever you want to call it, versus the West. This is not a struggle that still hangs over us in the same way. I was thinking that too. I was reading the passage again. It was natural to think that because 9/11 changed so much. It was such a pivot point of history. But what definitely felt like a civilizational struggle in that time period, 25 years on, almost, we're not talking about it so much anymore.
Anthony Quinn and I spoke about the friendship, the love that was forever May between Amis and Christopher Hitchens. I wanted to ask you, as somebody who very much in their professional life comfortably and successfully embodies both the journalist and the novelist.
Yeah.
Have you tried to incorporate as much as you can from the Hitch and as much as you can from Amis?
To a degree, yeah. I mean, I don't want to sound too immodest, I would say. But yes, I would say, Hitchens as an essayist and polemicist is truly unmatched. And I don't write like Hitchens. My style is not a Hitchens style, but there is a certain verve and energy he has that definitely, if you're a young writer, you look to.
How do you stop yourself from veering too far into stylistic writing when you're writing as a journalist and keep your literary fiction from sounding didactic or like you're trying to convey social realism comparable to reportage?
It's a really good question, and it's something I've pondered. There's sort of three modes I work in. There's journalism, the essay/column, and sometimes they're shorter columns, and sometimes they're longer essays, usually in places like Substack these days. And then there's the novel. And when I'm doing journalism or the column, let's say a short column, it is more formulaic. You have to acknowledge formulas. You have to acknowledge how styles, who you're writing for, does determine the scope and the shape of what you do. It's the sort of thing that it's almost a science as much as an art. I think one can write with flourish in journalism or the column, but really you're conveying information. You're an information merchant. You have to think about it that way. The essay and fiction, I get to flex different muscles. The essay, you are allowed for your literary flourishes. You can be more discursive. You can be more creative. You can push boundaries more because you're not necessarily just writing a workaday piece to inform people. You're informing people too, but you're doing it on a different plane. And in the fiction, I'm very conscious of the fact that I don't want to just process or blindly follow the rules one would follow with journalism. I think rules around journalism make a lot of sense. It makes sense to standardize it. I don't think a lot of those rules can be applied to fiction.
What did you make of Amis's writing guidance in Inside Story? There's plenty of it, and there's a lot of good stuff.
Yes.
Do you take issue with any of it?
I was drawn to a good deal of it. I think he was someone who thought deeply about the craft. And I would say I'm not as militant about rules for writing as someone like Amis would be. At the same time, I appreciate those who want to bring that sort of intensity to craft. But I try not to get too bound by them, I would say. And so for me, I'm trying to remember exactly which rule I shied away from. But speaking generally, I enjoy them. I enjoy writers writing on craft, and I enjoy him trying to demystify to a degree what he does. With fiction especially, there is almost something that is magical. Yes, there's a process that happens when you're sitting down and you're making things up.
He refers to it as a sort of holistic white magic. At least that's how he describes the urge to write that brings him to his desk.
I think so, yes. And that's, I think, what brings you to do it. What makes that process happen from the thought to the fingers, right? You can certainly teach writing and you can teach craft, but at some point, there's only so far you can lead someone, right? In athletics, right? You can learn how to play tennis, you can learn how to serve, you can learn how to shoot a basketball, but can you learn to hit a tennis ball like Djokovic? No. Shoot a basketball like LeBron James or someone. But I'm not saying every writer is that. What I'm saying is there is a degree of things that can't be taught. There's a lot that can, but I don't know how to teach someone to have a vision in their head and begin to impose it on the page and be comfortable with the fact that vision can shift. And you can be writing a scene and it's not like the architecture for a building. It's looser than that. I think a lot of fiction is looser than that, or at least mine is. It's general ideas and images and senses and urges and characters and voices that come to you, and then you're working through it. And so I do think there's a bit of that white magic, that what lures us there? Why do we do it? What compels us, right? The writer must be compelled in some way.
Ross Barkan, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you on this episode of My Martin Amis. Would you be so kind as to close this episode out with a great example of writing advice from Amis that you swear by?
Here's a great piece of advice from Amis, which really gets at why he's so good with words and how we, as perhaps aspiring writers or those aspiring to greatness, can also be good with words. Words lead a double life, and so far as I can see what this means, that you have to become something of an expert on them, an expert on words, and I spend another large fraction of my day looking them up. I find it stabilizing and also salutary. Every time I do it, I feel a gray cell being born, while no doubt a billion are blindly dying off. Check the exact definition, check the origin. that word is then more firmly yours. And for me, what Amis taught was to be curious about the world and to embrace your writerly ambition. I love that Amis was such a restless writer, that he was so unafraid of tackling these vast and difficult topics, whether it's time's arrow, the zone of interest. The information is a book sort of so rich with so much of the stuff that makes up life. That verve and that energy, I don't see enough of it in literature today, and I hope to bring that myself, and I hope others too can find the spirit of Amis. You know, there's so much focus on him as a character, him as a writerly celebrity of yesteryear, but really it's that passion and energy and ambition that is so central to his books. Even when he's not succeeding, the engine is spinning, and I think we have to be less afraid as writers, and we have to really shoot our best shots. And I felt like Amis always did that. There's a quote Philip Roth used to paraphrase, a quote from the boxer Joe Louis, and it was something along the lines of, I did the best with what I had. And I felt like Amis really did the best with his gift. He was always someone trying to give his best, and that's very exciting. And I think that's why people come back to him. I think that's why he endures. That's why he won't be readily forgotten, and why his books will be picked over for many years to come.
Ross, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.